Sophia Brooks, a woman of quiet strength and undeniable grace, steps onto a flight expecting nothing more than a routine journey. But when a flight attendant, Miranda Blake, makes a split-second judgment that strips Sophia of her dignity, it sets off a chain of events no one could have predicted. As tensions rise in the air and ripple through the airline, this story explores the power of assumptions, the weight of accountability, and the small moments of unexpected kindness that change lives. Miranda must confront the consequences of her actions, while Sophia refuses to let injustice go unanswered, standing firm not just for herself, but for something bigger. Can one mistake lead to something better? Can small gestures of kindness inspire real change? Sophia Brooks stepped into the crowded terminal of Chicago O'Hare International Airport. The hum of travelers moving in every direction filled the space, parents with restless children, business people on their phones, and college students huddled in groups. Despite the chaos, Sophia moved with quiet purpose. She wore a tailored navy blazer over cream blouse and black slacks, her heels clicking softly on the tiled floor. Her natural curls framed her sharp, thoughtful face. In one hand, she carried a sleek leather laptop bag. In the other, her boarding pass for first class. Sophia had always been someone who preferred order. Her life as a business consultant demanded it. Days filled with meetings, presentations, and client demands left little time for chaos. Even her mornings followed a strict routine: black coffee at 6, a 30-minute run, and a quick scan of her emails before starting the day. It gave her a sense of control, something she had fought hard to achieve. But beneath Sophia's composed exterior, there was a weariness that few saw. Traveling for work had its perks: a comfortable salary, recognition, and the chance to make a real difference. Yet, it also left her feeling unmoored. Hotel rooms that felt too cold, meals eaten alone, and the hum of airport terminals reminded her of how disconnected she often felt from the world around her. Sophia did not mind solitude, but there were times when it weighed on her more than she cared to admit. Today was one of those days. The long week behind her had been filled with back-to-back meetings with a corporate client whose leadership team seemed resistant to change. Sophia had spent hours carefully outlining strategies for improving employee morale and restructuring their workplace culture, yet every word had been met with polite dismissal. It was draining to fight for something you believed in when others could not see its value. Reaching the gate, Sophia handed her boarding pass to the smiling attendant, who scanned it without issue. Sophia offered a small nod of thanks before stepping onto the jet bridge. The flight to New York would be a short one, 2 hours at most, but she was grateful to have splurged on a first-class ticket. It was rare for her to indulge in luxury, but today it felt well-deserved. She needed the peace that a little extra space would bring. Inside the plane, the cool air and soft lighting offered an immediate sense of calm. Sophia navigated to her seat, 2A, and placed her bag carefully in the overhead compartment. She adjusted the small pillow on her seat and sat down, letting out a soft sigh as she retrieved her notebook and pen. Sophia always carried a notebook. Even in an age of tablets and smartphones, she liked the feel of paper under her fingertips. It made her thoughts feel more tangible. As the first-class cabin filled, Sophia allowed herself to settle into her own space. She began jotting down ideas for an upcoming presentation. Her handwriting was neat and deliberate, each word carefully chosen. Despite her focus, she could feel the occasional glance from the other passengers. It was not uncommon for her to stand out in places like this. She was used to it by now. Sophia was so absorbed in her notes that she barely noticed the flight attendant making her way down the aisle. Miranda Blake moved with practiced efficiency, her navy uniform crisp and spotless. She had been a flight attendant for nearly a decade and prided herself on her professionalism, yet something about Sophia made her pause. Stopping beside Sophia's seat, Miranda cleared her throat. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said in a tone that carried a faint edge. "May I see your boarding pass?" Sophia blinked, looking up from her notebook. She was caught off guard, but offered a polite smile as she reached into her blazer pocket. Of course. Miranda accepted the boarding pass, her sharp gaze scanning it quickly. Her frown deepened. "This is for first class?" she asked, her tone skeptical. Sophia nodded once, her calm demeanor intact. "That is correct." For a moment, Miranda seemed unsure of how to proceed. She handed the pass back without another word, but the tightness in her expression remained. Sophia watched her walk away, a flicker of confusion passing across her face. She had not expected this kind of scrutiny, though it was not entirely new to her. People often made assumptions about who she was or what she deserved. Shrugging it off, Sophia returned to her notes. But out of the corner of her eye, she noticed Miranda speaking quietly with another flight attendant near the front of the cabin. Both women glanced in her direction more than once, their whispers punctuated by uneasy expressions. Moments later, Miranda returned, her demeanor more authoritative this time. "Miss Brooks," she said firmly, folding her arms, "could you step aside for a moment? I need to verify something about your reservation." Sophia looked up again, this time her brow furrowing slightly. "Is there a problem?" she asked, though her voice remained calm. "I just need to confirm your booking," Miranda replied, her tone leaving little room for argument. Sophia hesitated, feeling the stares of nearby passengers settle on her like a weight. Though she wanted to argue, she knew that escalating the situation here would do her no good. With a quiet sigh, she gathered her bag and stood. "Very well." Miranda led Sophia toward the galley at the front of the plane, where the whispers of passengers faded into the hum of the aircraft. "There appears to be an issue with your ticket," Miranda said curtly. "It seems this seat may not have been booked properly. I will have to ask you to move to the main cabin." Sophia stared at her, disbelief flickering across her features. "I booked this seat weeks ago. There should not be an issue." Miranda's expression remained cold. "I already checked. Either you move, or I will have to involve security." The words stung, though Sophia did not let it show. Her grip tightened around the strap of her bag as she forced herself to stay composed. "Fine," she said softly. "Lead the way." The walk to the main cabin felt longer than it should have. Sophia could feel the eyes of other passengers burning into her back as she followed Miranda down the aisle. She passed rows of curious faces, some sympathetic, others indifferent. When they reached an empty middle seat halfway down the economy section, Miranda gestured toward it. "Here you go," she said flatly. Sophia placed her bag under the seat and sat down, her movements controlled, despite the storm building inside her. She kept her head high, refusing to let herself look small or defeated. As Miranda walked away, the weight of the situation began to settle on her. Sophia turned to the window, her calm mask beginning to crack. It was not just about the seat. It was about everything it represented: the assumptions, the dismissal, the quiet indignity of being told she did not belong. She had faced challenges like this before, but each time, it left a small scar she carried with her. Digging into her bag, Sophia retrieved her phone and quickly typed out a message to a contact in her network. Her fingers moved swiftly, her mind clear despite the frustration she felt. She hit send and slipped the phone back into her bag, her expression unreadable. Nearby, Clara Summers had been watching the situation unfold. She felt a tight knot of unease in her chest as she saw Sophia settle into the cramped seat. Gathering her courage, she approached Sophia cautiously, a small cup of water in her hands. "Ma'am," Clara said softly, her tone kind. "Is everything okay?" Sophia looked up, surprised by the sincerity in the young flight attendant's voice. For the first time since leaving her seat, a small smile tugged at her lips. "I am fine, thank you." Clara placed the water on the tray table. "If you need anything, just let me know," she said, her voice gentle before stepping away. Sophia watched her leave, feeling a small spark of warmth. It was such a simple gesture, but in that moment, it meant everything. As she sat back in her seat, gazing out the window at the sky stretching beyond, she let out a quiet breath. She would not let this define her. Not today. Sophia Brooks sat quietly in the cramped economy seat, the hum of the airplane engines filling the space around her. Outside the window, the sun had begun to set, casting an orange glow over the clouds. Though the view was beautiful, it did little to calm the storm of emotions brewing within her. Her composure, so carefully maintained, was starting to fray. She wasn't someone who allowed anger to take hold easily. Years of navigating difficult boardrooms and stubborn leadership teams had taught her that restraint was a weapon more powerful than any outburst. Yet this moment, the slow unraveling of dignity in front of strangers, cut deeper than most. It wasn't just about being moved to economy. It was about the quiet judgment behind it, the unspoken words in Miranda Blake's eyes that said, "You do not belong here." Sophia took a slow breath, her fingers gripping the armrest tightly before she forced herself to relax. She had already set something in motion with the message she sent before. This wasn't the first time she had been overlooked, and it likely would not be the last, but she had learned that change only happened when someone refused to let things slide. Nearby, Clara Summers moved carefully through the aisle, attending to passengers with the kind of warmth that softened even the most irritated traveler. Though young, she carried herself with a natural kindness, an instinct to see people for who they were, not what they looked like or where they sat. Clara had not forgotten what she had seen. She had watched Miranda's interaction with Sophia earlier, the hard set of Miranda's shoulders and Sophia's dignified walk to the back of the plane. Something about it did not sit right with her. After finishing her duties, Clara paused near the galley, frowning as she collected herself. Dennis Myers, the senior flight attendant, was preparing drinks nearby. Dennis had been working in the airline industry for years and had a reputation for being calm and dependable. He glanced at Clara, noticing her distracted expression. "What's on your mind, Clara?" Dennis asked, pouring coffee into a paper cup. Clara hesitated before speaking. "That woman Miranda moved to economy. Miss Brooks, I think her name is. She had a first-class ticket. I saw it." Dennis paused mid-pour, his brow furrowing slightly. "She had a valid ticket? And Miranda moved her anyway?" Clara nodded. "I don't know what happened exactly, but it didn't feel right. Miss Brooks didn't make a fuss about it, but I could tell she was upset. I don't know. It bothers me." Dennis sighed, shaking his head. He had seen these kinds of situations before. Miranda's good at her job, but she's got a habit of acting on instinct when she shouldn't. First class is tricky business, Clara. People pay a lot for those seats, and moving someone without cause, that's playing with fire. Clara shifted uncomfortably. "Do you think I should say something?" Dennis looked at her thoughtfully. "For now, just do your job the way you know is right. Be kind to people. If this turns into something bigger, trust me, we'll hear about it." Clara nodded, though she could not shake the uneasy feeling from earlier. Back in the economy cabin, Sophia sat with her back straight and her eyes focused on the seat in front of her. The murmurs of the passengers nearby had not gone unnoticed. A man across the aisle, dressed in casual jeans and a sweatshirt, leaned over slightly. He was middle-aged, with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor. "I saw what happened earlier," he said softly, careful not to draw attention. "That was out of line." Sophia turned to face him, surprised by his words. For a moment, she searched his face, unsure how to respond. She was not used to strangers offering unsolicited support. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice even. The man shrugged, offering a small, empathetic smile. "People make assumptions all the time. I've been there myself. Sometimes you have to remind them who you are." Sophia tilted her head slightly, curiosity flickering in her expression. "You've been there?" The man nodded. "Years ago, I was a teacher working at a school in a wealthy district. My students' parents would look at me and assume I didn't belong. I was young, came from a working-class family, and they'd question whether I was qualified. It was hard not to take it personally, but I pushed through. Eventually, they couldn't deny the work I was doing. Sophia regarded him carefully, his words hitting closer to home than she had expected. "That must have taken a lot of strength," she said softly. He smiled again, but this time there was a note of quiet understanding in his expression. "Sometimes strength is just getting through it without letting them see you falter." Sophia sat back in her seat, his words lingering in her mind. She had spent years building herself into someone others had to take seriously, someone who could walk into any room and command respect with her presence alone. But moments like these chipped away at that foundation, reminding her that progress was still fragile. Yet the man's kindness, the simple act of acknowledging what had happened, was enough to remind her that not everyone was the same. At the front of the plane, Miranda Blake moved briskly through the first-class cabin, her expression giving nothing away. On the surface, she appeared composed and confident, but inside, a small flicker of doubt had begun to creep into her mind. Something about Sophia Brooks unsettled her. She had moved passengers before for various reasons, mistakes in reservations, upgrades gone wrong, or technical errors, but this time felt different. Sophia's calm response to being humiliated had lingered in Miranda's thoughts longer than she cared to admit. She tried to push it out of her mind as she checked on a passenger's drink order, but it returned again when Dennis approached her near the galley. "Miranda," he said casually, his tone measured. "Did you move someone from first class earlier?" Miranda stiffened slightly, turning to face him. "Yeah, I did. Why?" Dennis crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "Clara mentioned it. She said the woman had a valid ticket." Miranda's jaw tightened. "I had a feeling something wasn't right. She didn't seem like—" She stopped herself, suddenly aware of what she was about to say. Dennis raised an eyebrow. "Didn't seem like what? Like someone who belongs up here?" Miranda glanced away, embarrassed. "I was just trying to follow protocol." Dennis sighed, his voice quieter now. "You know as well as I do that first-class passengers have high expectations. If she had a valid ticket, you're playing a dangerous game. You don't get to decide who belongs and who doesn't, Miranda." Miranda did not respond, but Dennis's words cut deep. She had always trusted her instincts, but now she wondered if they had betrayed her. As the plane continued its flight, the atmosphere in the economy cabin had shifted slightly. Sophia still felt the sting of what had happened, but the quiet moments of kindness, the glass of water from Clara, and the conversation with the man across the aisle had softened the edges of her frustration. She pulled out her notebook again and began to write, her handwriting steady as she focused her thoughts. She wrote about the importance of fairness, about the small gestures that made people feel seen, and about how easy it was for biases to creep in when you let them go unchecked. Clara passed by her row again, pausing to check on her. "Miss Brooks," she said softly, "is there anything else I can get you?" Sophia looked up, offering the young woman a genuine smile. "No, thank you. You've been very kind." Clara blushed slightly, but she smiled back. "It's my job," she said before moving on. Sophia watched her go, feeling something shift inside her. It wasn't much, just a glass of water and a kind word, but in that moment it had been enough. The low hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin as Sophia Brooks sat quietly in her cramped economy seat. The sunset had deepened into dusk, the fading orange light casting soft shadows across the aisle. The man across from her had returned to his book, his earlier words of solidarity still echoing in Sophia's mind. She leaned her head back against the seat, exhaling softly, her thoughts racing. Why had this happened? She could brush off the sting of being moved, but the implications ran deeper than inconvenience. It was not just about a seat. It was about being made to feel out of place, like she did not belong. In Sophia's line of work, workplace bias was a subject she knew all too well. She had spent years consulting companies on how to create inclusive environments, dismantle harmful assumptions, and promote accountability. Yet now, she found herself in the very situation she worked tirelessly to prevent. Sophia turned to the window, watching the endless stretch of clouds. Her notebook rested open on the tray table, but she could not bring herself to write. Instead, she let the hum of the engines fill the silence. At the front of the plane, Miranda Blake moved briskly between rows in first class, serving drinks and snacks with her usual efficiency. On the surface, her demeanor was composed, but inside, a knot of unease had begun to form. The conversation with Dennis earlier lingered in her mind. His words had struck a nerve. "You don't get to decide who belongs and who doesn't." Miranda hated the doubt creeping into her thoughts. She prided herself on her instincts, on her ability to manage the cabin and enforce order. But something about Sophia Brooks unsettled her. It wasn't that the woman had caused a scene, quite the opposite. Her calmness had been unnerving, as if she were quietly observing everything and waiting. And that look when Sophia met her eyes before leaving first class had stayed with her. It wasn't anger or even frustration. It was something worse: disappointment. Miranda turned to the galley, where Dennis was prepping the next drink cart. The seasoned flight attendant gave her a glance steady and unreadable, as always. "You okay?" Dennis asked without looking up from the rows of drinks he was arranging. Miranda stiffened. "I'm fine." "Doesn't look like it," Dennis said casually. He slid a tray of beverages into place and straightened up, turning to face her. "You've been walking around here like a ghost." Miranda frowned, her tone defensive. "It's nothing. I just wanted to make sure everything was in order." Dennis raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" Miranda said nothing, but the heat in her face betrayed her. Dennis sighed, shaking his head. "Miranda, I've been at this a long time. You know what happens when you mess with the wrong passenger?" She glanced at him, a flicker of defiance in her gaze. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means first-class passengers aren't just paying for comfort," Dennis said, his tone calm but firm. "They're paying for respect. You move someone without a good reason, and you better hope they don't have connections." Miranda's heart skipped a beat, though she masked it with a sharp reply. "I had a reason." Dennis studied her for a moment, his expression softening. "You sure about that?" he repeated. Miranda turned away, grabbing the drink tray. "Let's just focus on the service." Dennis let her go, but his warning echoed in her mind. Back in economy, Clara Summers made her way down the aisle, her tray balanced neatly in her hands as she served passengers water and snacks. When she reached Sophia's row, she paused. Sophia sat still, her posture straight, her gaze fixed on the view outside. "Ma'am," Clara said softly, holding out a cup of water, "would you like something to drink?" Sophia turned, offering a polite smile. "Thank you." She accepted the water and set it on the tray table. Clara hesitated for a moment, shifting on her feet. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. About earlier." Sophia's brow lifted slightly, surprised by the young woman's sincerity. "It wasn't your fault." Clara bit her lip, looking down briefly before meeting Sophia's gaze again. "I know, but it wasn't fair. I could tell you had a first-class ticket. You shouldn't have been moved." Sophia regarded Clara thoughtfully. There was a raw honesty in the young woman's words that softened something in Sophia's chest. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I appreciate you saying that." Clara smiled faintly, relieved by Sophia's response. "If you need anything else, just let me know," she added, before continuing down the aisle. Sophia watched her go, her fingers lightly tapping against her notebook. It was a small gesture, but Clara's words carried weight. Sophia had spent years training people to recognize their biases and speak up when they saw something wrong. Here was someone young and unsure who had chosen to say something anyway. It mattered. Sophia opened her notebook again and began to write. This time, the words flowed. Near the front of the plane, Miranda's unease continued to grow. She glanced toward the economy cabin, where Sophia sat quietly, her notebook open. Something about the woman's composure unsettled Miranda even more now. "Did you see her?" Miranda murmured to one of the other attendants, a younger woman named Renee. Renee blinked, confused. "Who?" Miranda tilted her head slightly toward the back. "The woman I moved earlier, Brooks. She's too calm. It's like she's waiting for something." Renee gave her a bewildered look. "Miranda, if she had a valid ticket, why did you move her?" Miranda stiffened. "I thought something was wrong. I followed protocol." Renee said nothing, but her silence spoke volumes. Miranda turned away, frustration bubbling in her chest. Why was everyone questioning her? At the same time, Dennis made his way to the front of the plane. The in-flight phone buzzed in the galley, its chime sharp and unexpected. Dennis answered it with his usual calm demeanor. "This is Dennis." A voice crackled on the other end. "This is the captain. Can you send Miranda to the galley, please?" Dennis's brow furrowed. "Understood, sir." He turned toward the cabin, where Miranda was finishing her final checks in first class. "Miranda," he called softly. She looked up, already sensing something was wrong. "What is it?" Dennis's expression gave nothing away. "The captain wants to speak with you. Now." Miranda's stomach dropped. "What? Why?" "Go find out," Dennis said, his tone unreadable. Miranda hesitated before placing the drink tray down and straightening her uniform. Her heart raced as she walked briskly toward the galley, every step heavier than the last. When she reached the cockpit door, the captain's voice came through the intercom. "Miranda, we've received a communication from the airline's executive office. There's a passenger on board Sophia Brooks who has submitted a direct complaint." Miranda froze. The words hit her like a punch to the chest. "Miss Brooks," the captain continued, "is connected to the airline's board of directors. The executive office is now monitoring this situation, and they've instructed us to handle it professionally. Do you understand?" Miranda felt the blood drain from her face. She gripped the edge of the galley counter to steady herself. "Yes, sir," she managed to whisper. "Good. I expect there to be no further incidents. Return to your duties." The intercom went silent. Miranda remained frozen for a moment, her pulse pounding in her ears. When she turned back toward the cabin, her hands were trembling. In the economy cabin, Sophia continued writing in her notebook, the steady movement of her pen a small act of control. She glanced up briefly as the flight attendant Clara passed by, offering a kind smile. "Thank you," Sophia whispered again, her voice warm. Clara returned the smile before continuing on, unaware of the ripple her kindness had started. Miranda Blake stood frozen near the cockpit door, the captain's words ringing in her ears. "Sophia Brooks is connected to the airline's board of directors." The truth hit her like a sharp slap, stealing the air from her lungs. She had underestimated the woman, misjudged her. Worse, she knew it wasn't just about one mistake. It was about why she made it. Miranda had relied on a hunch, an instinct that Sophia didn't belong, and now that instinct had betrayed her. For the first time in years, Miranda felt a crack in her confidence. She prided herself on her ability to keep order in the cabin, to manage even the most demanding passengers. Yet, her actions today had been rash, and the consequences were mounting faster than she could process. She forced herself to take a deep breath, smoothing the wrinkles in her uniform with trembling hands. There was no undoing what had been done, but perhaps, just perhaps, she could contain it. Back in the economy cabin, Sophia Brooks remained seated, her notebook now closed and tucked away into her bag. The faint hum of conversations and rustling seatbelts filled the space around her, but she tuned it all out. Her face was composed, but her mind was anything but still. Sophia had spent years fighting against moments like this time, when she had to remind others of her worth, when the assumptions of strangers carried more weight than the truth of who she was. Today was no different, and while her anger simmered beneath the surface, it was tempered by something else resolve. The message she had sent earlier ensured that the wheels were already in motion. Sophia was not someone who sought revenge, but she believed in accountability. Actions had consequences, and she would see this through not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever been made to feel invisible. Her thoughts were interrupted when Clara Summers appeared in the aisle again. The young flight attendant had a cup of tea, balanced carefully on a small tray. "Miss Brooks," Clara said softly, leaning toward her, "I brought you some tea. I thought it might help you relax." Sophia looked up, surprise flickering across her face. For a moment she said nothing, her gaze searching Clara's face as if trying to read her intent. All she found was sincerity. "Thank you, Clara," Sophia said quietly, her voice warm. She accepted the tea, the paper cup heating her palms as she held it. Clara lingered for just a moment longer. I hope this isn't out of place, but you've been so calm through everything. I just wanted to say, I really admire that." Sophia blinked, caught off guard. It was not the kind of thing people often said to her. Calmness, to Sophia, was a necessity, something she had cultivated over years of fighting uphill battles. But to hear someone notice it, let alone admire it, left her momentarily speechless. "Thank you," Sophia said again, a small, genuine smile crossing her face. "That's very kind of you." Clara smiled back, clearly relieved, and turned to continue down the aisle. Sophia watched her go, the interaction lingering in her thoughts. It was such a small gesture, tea, and a few kind words, but it chipped away at the weight Sophia carried. It reminded her that not everyone made judgments based on what they assumed. In the first-class galley, Miranda returned to her duties, though her hands still trembled slightly. Dennis Myers noticed immediately. The older flight attendant had a way of reading people, and Miranda's strained expression was impossible to miss. "Are you going to tell me what's going on?" Dennis asked quietly, as he arranged a row of glasses on a tray. Miranda shot him a look. "It's nothing." Dennis raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. "You sure? Because you look like you've just been chewed out by the captain." Miranda froze, her expression betraying her. Dennis straightened, his voice softening. "What happened?" Miranda hesitated. She didn't want to admit the truth, not even to Dennis, but there was something in his steady gaze that disarmed her. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and strained. "The passenger I moved, Sophia Brooks, she's connected to the board of directors," Miranda said. "The captain got a call from the executive office." Dennis's expression shifted from curiosity to something more serious. "The board?" he repeated slowly. Miranda nodded, swallowing hard. "I didn't know. I thought something wasn't right with her. I didn't mean—" Her words trailed off. Dennis let out a low sigh, shaking his head. "Miranda, you've been at this job long enough to know better. You don't move someone from first class unless you have a real reason. She didn't seem right, isn't a reason." Miranda flinched, shame twisting in her chest. "I thought I was following protocol." Dennis's gaze softened slightly, though his tone remained firm. "You were following your assumptions, not protocol. And now you're paying for it." Miranda turned away, unable to meet his eyes. "Look," Dennis continued after a moment, "you can't undo what's been done, but you can make sure it doesn't get worse. You need to be careful, Miranda. People like Sophia Brooks don't let things like this slide." Miranda said nothing. She already knew he was right. The tension on the plane grew heavier as the minutes ticked by. The hum of the engines seemed louder, the cabin quieter. Passengers had noticed that something was off, though they couldn't quite name it. Sophia remained composed, sipping her tea slowly as she watched the faint glow of the sunset disappear beyond the clouds. Her phone buzzed once in her bag, and she retrieved it quietly, reading the message that appeared on the screen. "We've been notified. They're monitoring the situation. Let me know if anything else happens." Sophia's lips pressed into a thin line as she slipped the phone back into her bag. She felt the faintest sense of satisfaction, knowing that the incident had not been ignored. The system was at work now, and while it wouldn't undo what had happened, it would ensure that someone was held accountable. Meanwhile, Miranda's unease had reached its peak. She moved through first class on autopilot, her hands carrying trays and refilling drinks without much thought. But her mind was elsewhere, replaying the moments leading up to her decision to move Sophia Brooks. She hadn't stopped to question herself then. She had felt so certain, so justified in her actions. Now, that certainty was gone, replaced by doubt that gnawed at her. As Miranda passed by Dennis in the galley again, he looked at her with something close to pity. "It's a long flight when you're carrying a mistake, isn't it?" Miranda didn't answer, but the words hit her harder than she wanted to admit. Clara Summers returned to the galley near the end of the flight. Her duties finished for the moment. She passed Dennis, who gave her a small nod of approval. "Good job today, kid," he said simply. Clara smiled faintly, but hesitated before speaking. "I hope Miss Brooks is okay," she said softly. Dennis glanced toward the economy cabin, where Sophia sat in calm stillness. "She's tougher than most people, Clara. Trust me on that." Clara nodded, though she still felt the weight of what had happened. She had seen something unfair, and had done what little she could to make it right. It wasn't much, but maybe it had made a difference. As the plane began its descent, Sophia closed her eyes briefly, the hum of the engines steadying her thoughts. Clara's kindness, the man's quiet words of understanding, and even Dennis's steady presence, they were reminders that the world wasn't all bad. She would see this through. She always did. As the plane began its descent into New York, the cabin buzzed with the usual activity that marked the end of a flight. Seatbelts clicked into place, window shades were adjusted, and the hum of whispered conversations filled the space. But for Sophia Brooks, the noise faded into the background. She sat motionless, her teacup empty on the tray table in front of her. From the window, the city skyline shimmered faintly in the distance, the lights below flickering like stars. A long sigh escaped her lips as she adjusted her posture. She could feel the heaviness of the last couple of hours settle in her bones. Sophia always carried herself with calm dignity, but even she had her limits. This experience, being humiliated and escorted from a seat she had rightfully paid for, had tested her in ways she had not anticipated. Yet, as she glanced at her reflection faintly mirrored in the window, she reminded herself of something her father used to say. "When someone tries to make you small, you remind them how tall you stand." She straightened her back, her composure firmly in place. She would deal with this, as she always did, gracefully and decisively. At the front of the plane, Miranda Blake was standing near the galley, her movements tense and mechanical. Her shoulders were stiff, her hands clasped in front of her. She kept sneaking glances toward the economy cabin, where Sophia sat poised, composed, and perfectly silent. Miranda's stomach twisted. She couldn't shake the feeling that something more was coming, something she could no longer control. The captain's warning had been clear enough. Her career, built over years of service, now felt like it was dangling by a thread. Dennis Myers, her senior colleague, approached her quietly. He had watched Miranda struggle through the last hour, though he had said little. Now, with the plane preparing to land, he stepped closer. "Miranda," Dennis said softly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You can't fix this by ignoring it." Miranda's jaw tightened as she turned to face him. "What am I supposed to do?" she muttered. "I've already messed up. It's too late." Dennis held her gaze, his expression steady. "Owning up to a mistake isn't weakness. It's the only way you learn." Miranda didn't respond. She turned her attention to the cabin, where the flight attendants were completing the final checks. Her chest ached with regret, but it was regret that she could not yet bring herself to voice. As the plane touched down with a smooth thud and began its taxi to the gate, Clara Summers lingered near the back of the plane, stealing another glance at Sophia Brooks. The woman remained calm, her face serene despite everything that had happened. Clara admired that. In her short time as a flight attendant, Clara had seen plenty of passengers lose their composure over far less: a delayed flight, a misplaced bag, or a missing drink order. But Sophia had handled being humiliated and moved to economy with a dignity Clara could only hope to possess one day. Clara hesitated for a moment, debating with herself. Then she decided. She stepped closer to Sophia's row and spoke softly. "Miss Brooks?" Sophia turned to her, her expression neutral, but not unkind. "Yes?" "I just wanted to say—" Clara swallowed nervously before continuing. "I'm really sorry for what happened today. It wasn't right. And I hope you know that not everyone feels the same way. Some of us see you." For a moment, Sophia simply looked at her, as though weighing her words carefully. Then, something shifted in her expression just slightly. "Thank you," Sophia said, her voice soft but steady. "That means more than you know." Clara smiled faintly, relieved. "I hope the rest of your day goes better." "It already has," Sophia replied. Clara lingered for just a moment longer before stepping back, her heart lighter. She couldn't change what had happened, but she hoped she had at least left a small mark, a reminder that there were still people who cared. The doors to the plane finally opened, and passengers began shuffling down the aisle, eager to exit after the long flight. Sophia waited patiently, letting the hurried crowd move past her. She had no desire to rush. She preferred to leave quietly, unnoticed. As she reached for her bag under the seat, the man across the aisle, the one who had spoken to her earlier, leaned closer again. "Miss Brooks," he said softly, "I just wanted to say, I admire how you handled yourself today." Sophia turned to him, her expression softening. "Thank you." He smiled, the kind of smile that came with understanding. "I've seen a lot of people lose their temper over far less. It takes strength to stay calm." Sophia tilted her head slightly. "Sometimes calm is the only choice you have." The man chuckled quietly, nodding in agreement. "Fair enough. Safe travels." Sophia smiled faintly, slipping her bag over her shoulder. "You too." As she stepped into the aisle, she could feel the eyes of others on her, some curious, others sympathetic. She didn't look back. Miranda watched from the galley as Sophia made her way off the plane. She stood frozen, her hand still gripping the edge of the drink cart. When Sophia reached the front, she paused just slightly, turning her head to look at Miranda. For a brief moment, their eyes met. There was no anger in Sophia's gaze, no malice, only a quiet calm that unnerved Miranda more than any outburst ever could. "Good evening," Sophia said softly, her voice steady. Miranda swallowed, trying to find the right words, but they wouldn't come. "Good evening, Miss Brooks," she managed to mumble, her voice barely audible. Sophia nodded once before stepping off the plane, disappearing into the bright lights of the jet bridge. Miranda let out a shaky breath, her chest tight. She turned away, unable to shake the feeling that she had just lost far more than her composure. Sophia walked purposefully through the terminal, the hum of the airport washing over her. She ignored the hurried footsteps and distant announcements, her focus on the path ahead. Her phone buzzed in her bag, and she retrieved it quickly. "The airline has been notified. They'll follow up with you shortly." Sophia's lips pressed into a thin line as she typed a quick reply. "Thank you. Let's make sure this is handled properly." Sliding her phone back into her bag, she adjusted the strap on her shoulder and kept walking. She was not angry anymore. Instead, she felt resolute. She would not let this moment go unanswered, not out of vengeance, but because she knew what it meant. If no one spoke up, nothing would change. As she waited near baggage claim, Sophia spotted the man from the plane again. He gave her a small wave, and she returned it with a polite nod. His earlier words stuck with her. It takes strength to stay calm. She thought about Clara, the young flight attendant whose kindness had made the sting of the situation a little softer. In the face of adversity, small gestures like that mattered more than people realized. As her sleek black suitcase appeared on the carousel, Sophia grabbed it effortlessly and turned toward the exit. The cool night air greeted her as she stepped outside, where her driver, William, waited with the car door open. "Good evening, Miss Brooks," he greeted her warmly. "Good evening, William," Sophia replied, stepping into the car with practiced grace. As they pulled away from the terminal, Sophia leaned back in her seat, her mind already turning toward what came next. This was not over, not yet. She gazed out the window at the passing city lights, the weight of the day beginning to lift from her shoulders. The sting of being dismissed would fade, but the determination it had sparked would not. Somewhere in the back of her mind, Sophia thought about Clara's soft apology and the man's quiet encouragement. These small moments of kindness had not erased the injustice of the day, but they reminded her that people still cared, and sometimes that was enough to keep going. The drive from the airport was silent, save for the quiet hum of traffic passing in the night. Sophia Brooks sat in the back seat of the black sedan, her gaze fixed on the dark city streets outside the window. Her driver, William, kept his eyes on the road, sensing her need for stillness. Sophia appreciated his understanding. Some people filled silence with empty chatter, but William had worked for her long enough to know when she needed space to process. And tonight, she did. As the car stopped at a red light, Sophia's mind drifted back to the events of the flight, every detail replaying in slow motion. Miranda Blake's sharp, dismissive tone, the quiet whispers of passengers as she walked through the first-class cabin to economy, the quiet strength she had been forced to summon to stay calm. Sophia pressed her fingertips to her temples and exhaled softly, letting the tension roll off her shoulders, though it did not go far. She thought about the moments that had softened the experience, the man's quiet encouragement and Clara's small act of kindness. A glass of tea and a heartfelt apology should not have meant so much, yet they did. It was strange how often the smallest gestures left the deepest marks. "Is everything all right, Miss Brooks?" William asked gently as the car eased forward. Sophia blinked and turned to face him. "Yes, William, just a long day." He nodded, his expression knowing. "We'll have you home in no time." Sophia leaned back against the seat, her body exhausted, but her mind still alert. This was not over. It could not be. Back at the airport, Miranda Blake stood in the galley of the now empty plane, her hands gripping the edge of the counter so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The passengers had disembarked, and the cabin crew was beginning the routine cleanup process. But Miranda stayed frozen, the events of the flight hanging over her like a storm cloud she could not outrun. "Miranda," Dennis Myers's voice broke through her thoughts, low but insistent. "We need to talk." Miranda turned slowly to face him. The calm, measured look on his face unnerved her. It was the look of someone who saw right through her attempts to hide the truth. "What is it?" she asked, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. Dennis sighed and crossed his arms, his voice soft but firm. "I've been watching you all day. Whatever happened between you and that passenger Sophia Brooks, it's eating you alive." Miranda turned away, pretending to check a row of seats, though there was nothing out of place. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," Dennis replied evenly. "You're better than this, Miranda. You've been flying long enough to know that snap judgments come back to bite you." "I wasn't making snap judgments," she said defensively, though even as the words left her mouth, they felt hollow. Dennis tilted his head, studying her. "Then why did you move her? What made you so sure she didn't belong in first class?" Miranda opened her mouth to respond, but froze. The answer sat heavy on her tongue, too ugly to speak aloud. She thought back to the moment she had seen Sophia sitting in that seat so poised, so composed, and something inside her had balked. She couldn't explain it, but in that instant, her mind had decided Sophia did not belong. And now, here she was, fumbling for words as regret twisted inside her like a knife. I thought there was a mistake, Miranda said weakly. Dennis raised an eyebrow. Did you check before asking her to move? Miranda's silence was answer enough. Dennis shook his head, disappointment lining his features. You let your assumptions make a decision for you. That's not protocol, Miranda. That's a mistake. Miranda's chest tightened as she gripped the counter harder, her palms damp with sweat. I didn't mean for this to happen, she whispered. I know, Dennis said softly. But intent doesn't erase impact. You embarrassed her in front of an entire plane full of people, and now… He trailed off, giving her a pointed look. Now she's not just anyone. She's someone who has the power to hold you accountable. The words stung, but Miranda knew he was right. Sophia Brooks was not a woman to underestimate. That much had been clear from the moment Miranda had met her eyes. Sophia's calm response to the humiliation had been far more unnerving than anger ever could have been. Maybe it's not too late to fix this, Dennis said after a pause. Miranda turned sharply toward him. How? Dennis shrugged, his expression thoughtful. Apologize. Not because you have to, but because it's the right thing to do. Miranda stared at him, her throat tight. The thought of facing Sophia made her stomach churn with dread, but deep down, she knew Dennis was right. Avoiding this would only make the situation worse. By the time Miranda left the plane and made her way through the airport, she felt the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her. The terminal had emptied, leaving behind only echoes of travelers who had passed through hours earlier. As she walked toward the crew exit, Miranda spotted Clara Summers waiting by the door, holding her bag. Clara's expression was tentative, but there was something firm in the way she stood. Miranda, Clara said softly as she approached. Miranda slowed, stopping a few feet away. What is it, Clara? Clara shifted her weight, her voice calm but steady. I think you should know. I apologized to Miss Brooks earlier. Miranda blinked, startled. What? I apologized, Clara repeated, meeting Miranda's gaze. I told her it wasn't right. What happened to her? I couldn't let her think we were all like that. For a long moment, Miranda said nothing. Something sharp and uncomfortable twisted in her chest. Clara's words were so simple, yet they carried a weight that hit Miranda harder than she expected. You think I should apologize too, Miranda said finally, her voice hollow. I think it's up to you, Clara replied, but she deserves it. Miranda turned away, the walls of the airport stretching endlessly before her. She had always been so sure of herself, so quick to make decisions without second-guessing, but now she felt like she was standing on shaky ground. Clara's quiet voice broke through her thoughts one last time. You know, Miss Brooks didn't say much, but I could tell she appreciated being treated with kindness. It matters, even when it's small. Miranda didn't respond as Clara turned and walked away. Instead, she stood there, staring at the faint reflections of herself in the glass doors ahead. Clara's words haunted her. It matters, even when it's small. For the first time in a long time, Miranda Blake didn't know what to do next. Meanwhile, Sophia sat in the quiet stillness of her apartment, a warm cup of herbal tea in her hands. The space around her was pristine, a cozy haven in neutral tones and soft lighting. But tonight, it felt emptier than usual. She leaned against the arm of the couch, her thoughts drifting to the moments of the flight that had lingered most Clara's kind words, the man's quiet solidarity, and even Dennis's steady, observant demeanor. People often underestimated the power of kindness, Sophia thought. They dismissed it as soft or small, but it was neither. Sometimes it was the only thing that made a difference. Sophia set the cup down on the coffee table and reached for her phone, typing a quick message to her assistant. Set up a meeting with the airline's leadership. We need to discuss next steps. She placed the phone back on the table and sat quietly for a moment, staring at the reflection of the city lights outside her window. The events of the day had shaken something loose in her, but they had also reinforced what she already knew to be true. Progress required accountability. And sometimes the smallest gestures, an apology, a kind word, a moment of understanding could set that accountability in motion. The next morning, the city bustled beneath a thin gray sky as Sophia Brooks entered the towering glass building that housed the airline's headquarters. Her heels echoed faintly against the marble floors of the lobby, the sound steady and deliberate. Sophia had always believed that composure was power, and today she carried herself with a calm authority that turned a few heads. Dressed in a navy blue pantsuit, her natural curls framing her face, Sophia looked every bit the woman who refused to be overlooked. She had spent the evening preparing for this moment, reflecting on what had happened and what needed to change. This was no longer just about her. This was about ensuring that people like Miranda Blake learned to see others differently. It was about setting a standard that could not be ignored. As she reached the reception desk, a polite assistant greeted her. "Good morning, Miss Brooks. Mr. Hale is expecting you," the assistant said, referencing Richard Hale, the airline's CEO. "Please follow me." Sophia nodded, her face calm, as she followed the assistant through the halls. At the same time, Miranda Blake sat alone in her apartment, her breakfast untouched in front of her. A knot of anxiety had settled deep in her chest, making it hard to eat or even breathe properly. She stared at her phone, the screen still blank. No updates from the airline, no messages from her colleagues. The silence was suffocating. Dennis's words from the night before rang in her ears. "Owning up to a mistake isn't weakness. It's the only way you learn." Miranda knew he was right. She had let her assumptions cloud her judgment, and it had led her to humiliate someone who hadn't deserved it. But how did you face someone like Sophia Brooks, a woman so composed, so powerful when you knew you had wronged her? Miranda picked up her phone, scrolling through her messages for what felt like the 100th time. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. What could she even say? "I'm sorry," felt woefully inadequate. Her thoughts were interrupted by an email notification. She opened it, her stomach dropping as she read the contents. Subject: Incident Review, Flight 287. From Airline Executive Office to Miranda Blake. Dear Miss Blake, the incident involving passenger Sophia Brooks on Flight 287 is under formal review. You are expected to provide a written statement addressing your actions and decisions during the flight. Further disciplinary measures will depend on the findings of this review. Please respond by the end of the day. Miranda set the phone down, her hands trembling. This was the moment she had feared. Yet deep down, she knew it was coming. The consequences were unavoidable now, and the only choice she had left was whether to face them or run from them. She glanced at the clock and exhaled shakily. "I need to fix this." Sophia sat across from Richard Hale, the airline's CEO, in his spacious corner office. Richard was a tall man in his late 50s with silver streaks in his hair and an expression that revealed little of what he was thinking. He sat behind a sleek desk, his hands folded neatly on the surface. "Miss Brooks," he began, his tone professional. "Thank you for taking the time to meet with me. Let me start by saying that we deeply regret what happened on your flight yesterday. I've already reviewed the initial details of the incident, and I can assure you that this matter is being taken very seriously." Sophia nodded, her expression composed but firm. "I appreciate that, Mr. Hale, but I didn't come here for apologies." Richard's brow lifted slightly. "Go on." "I came here because this incident wasn't just a mistake. It was a symptom of a larger issue," Sophia said, leaning forward slightly. bias, conscious or not, affects how we see people. And when it's left unchecked, it leads to decisions like the one your flight attendant made. Decisions that humiliate, alienate, and harm people who have done nothing wrong. Richard sat back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. I understand your concern, and I agree that this cannot be ignored. We've already begun a review of our training programs to address these issues. With respect, Mr. Hale, Sophia said, meeting his gaze. Reviews and apologies aren't enough. Change requires more than words. It requires action. Richard considered her for a moment, then nodded. What would you suggest? Sophia reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the desk. Here's what I propose: a mandatory sensitivity and bias training program for all employees, not just the flight crew, but everyone. That includes leadership, customer service teams, and ground staff. Richard opened the folder, scanning the contents. This is thorough. It's necessary, Sophia replied. People need to learn to recognize their assumptions and question them before making decisions that hurt others. I know change takes time, but it has to start somewhere. Richard set the folder down, his expression unreadable for a moment before he nodded slowly. You're right, this is long overdue. Sophia allowed herself a faint smile, though her tone remained serious. I want regular updates on the progress. I'll work with your team if necessary to ensure this gets implemented properly. Richard extended his hand across the desk. Miss Brooks, I give you my word. We'll make this right. Sophia shook his hand firmly, feeling the first flicker of satisfaction. Change would not happen overnight, but this was a start. Meanwhile, Miranda arrived at the airline's headquarters just before noon, her heart pounding as she entered the building. The lobby seemed colder and more intimidating than she remembered. She kept her head down, clutching the statement she had written earlier that morning, a mixture of explanation and apology she still wasn't sure was good enough. A receptionist directed her to a small conference room where two members of the executive team were waiting. Miranda's footsteps felt heavy as she entered. Her palms slick with nerves, she sat down, her breath shallow as one of the executives, a sharp-eyed woman named Karen Mills, began to speak. Miss Blake, Karen said, her tone even, you are here to address the incident involving Sophia Brooks. We've reviewed the initial details, and we'd like to hear your account. Miranda swallowed hard and nodded, unfolding the statement in her hands. Her voice shook slightly as she began to read. I made a mistake, she said softly. When I asked Miss Brooks to leave her seat, I acted on an assumption that I didn't take the time to verify. I let my own biases influence my decision, and in doing so, I humiliated her. I'm deeply sorry for what I did. It wasn't fair, and I take full responsibility. Karen watched her closely as Miranda finished, her hands trembling slightly. For a moment, the room was silent. Miss Blake, Karen said finally, her tone softer than before. Acknowledging your mistake is the first step. However, this incident has had serious consequences, and the airline will need to determine the appropriate action moving forward. Miranda nodded, her voice quiet. I understand. As she left the room, Miranda felt a strange mix of emotions, regret, fear, and, somewhere deep beneath it all, relief. She had faced the truth, and though it would not erase what she had done, it was better than running from it. Sophia sat in her car later that afternoon, the city skyline stretching endlessly before her as William navigated through traffic. She had done what she came to do, but her thoughts still lingered on the young flight attendant, Clara, and the quiet moments of kindness that had softened the sharp edges of the day before. People like Clara were the reason Sophia believed change was possible. Kindness, when paired with accountability, could ripple outward and reshape the way people saw one another. Sophia turned her gaze to the window, watching the light begin to break through the gray sky. Change took time, she reminded herself, but it started with small steps. And sometimes, that was all you needed to begin. Miranda Blake sat on the edge of her couch, staring at the half-packed duffel bag on her living room floor. Her apartment, usually pristine, felt smaller and more suffocating today. The curtains were drawn, shutting out the morning light, as though shielding her from the world outside. A stack of mail sat unopened on the table, but she couldn't bring herself to care. The words of the executive panel replayed in her mind, their tone formal but firm. The airline will determine the appropriate action. For the first time in years, Miranda didn't feel like the confident, composed professional she had once been. She felt unsteady, like a ship without an anchor. The memory of Sophia Brooks's composed expression haunted her. Miranda had expected anger, confrontation, but instead, Sophia's calm had unnerved her more than anything else. It was like looking into a mirror and seeing all of her own insecurities reflected back. Miranda had worked her way up from the bottom, priding herself on her instincts, her professionalism, her ability to keep passengers in line. But now, those same instincts had cost her everything she had worked for. And the worst part, she couldn't even defend herself. Deep down, she knew she had been wrong. She hadn't asked for verification, hadn't paused to consider whether her actions were fair. She had assumed. Owning up to a mistake isn't weakness, Dennis's words echoed in her mind again. Sighing, Miranda grabbed her phone from the coffee table and scrolled to the email thread from the airline's executive team. It was time to stop hiding. She tapped out a message, hesitating only briefly before pressing send. "I'd like the opportunity to apologize to Miss Brooks directly. Please let me know how I can make this right." Her thumb hovered over the screen, nerves knotting her stomach, but she hit send. The message was out of her hands now, and for the first time in days, Miranda felt the faintest sliver of relief. Across the city, Sophia Brooks stood at the window of her corner office, a steaming cup of tea cradled in her hands. The view stretched out before her, a sprawling cityscape of skyscrapers and bustling streets. To anyone else, it might have looked impressive, even enviable. But to Sophia, it was just another reminder of how far she had come. Her office was modern and understated, the shelves lined with books on leadership, psychology, and workplace culture. Framed photos sat on her desk, her parents, smiling at a family picnic, and one of herself on stage at a leadership conference. A small vase of fresh white lilies sat beside them, a simple but grounding touch in a space built for work. Sophia took a sip of tea and turned back to her desk, where her phone buzzed softly with a new message. Her assistant, Marcy, had forwarded it from the airline's executive office. "Miranda Blake has requested the opportunity to apologize to you directly. Please let us know if you'd be open to this." Sophia stared at the words, her expression unreadable. She sat down in her chair, placing the cup of tea carefully on the desk as she considered her response. An apology. For years, Sophia had seen moments like these play out in boardrooms and offices, people who made mistakes, who said or did the wrong thing, and then realized too late that they couldn't take it back. Some apologized because they felt genuine remorse. Others did it out of obligation, hoping to salvage what they had lost. The difference, she knew, was in how they acted after the apology. Sophia leaned back in her chair, folding her hands in her lap as she thought about Miranda Blake. She remembered the defensiveness in the woman's posture, the way her eyes had darted away when their gazes met. But she also remembered Clara, the young flight attendant who had spoken up when no one else did, and Dennis, whose steady presence suggested he saw more than he let on. People can change, Sophia thought, but they have to want to. She picked up her phone and typed a reply. "I will meet with her. Arrange a time." The following afternoon, Miranda found herself sitting in a private conference room at the airline's headquarters, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The space was minimal and professional, neutral walls, a large table, and chairs that were far less comfortable than they looked. Her heart pounded in her chest as she waited, her thoughts racing. It was strange, Miranda thought, how quickly everything could unravel. One mistake, one judgment made in a split second had brought her here, sitting in a cold room with her career hanging in the balance. When the door opened, Miranda stood instinctively. Sophia Brooks entered the room, her presence as striking as Miranda remembered. She wore a dark green blazer over a cream blouse, her natural curls framing her face, her posture impeccable. She offered Miranda a polite nod before sitting across the table. "Miss Blake," Sophia began, her tone calm but measured. "Thank you for reaching out." Miranda swallowed hard as she sat back down, her hands trembling slightly on the table. "Miss Brooks," she began, her voice soft but steady, "I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to speak with you. I owe you an apology." Sophia said nothing, waiting. Miranda took a shaky breath. "What I did on that flight was wrong. I assumed about you, and I acted on it without thinking. I didn't verify the facts. I didn't treat you with the respect you deserved. And for that, I am deeply sorry." Sophia studied her carefully, her gaze unwavering. Why did you make that assumption?" she asked quietly. Miranda flinched at the question, her face reddening. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice tight. "Maybe it was bias. Maybe I wasn't thinking clearly. But that's not an excuse. I've spent the last few days asking myself that same question. And the truth is, I can't justify what I did." Sophia nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "Do you understand how your actions impacted me?" Miranda's throat tightened. "I do now," she said softly. "You paid for that seat. You belonged in first class, and I treated you as if you didn't. I embarrassed you in front of the other passengers, and I made you feel unwelcome." Sophia leaned back slightly, still watching her. "What will you do differently next time?" Miranda took a breath, her voice more certain now. "I'll stop and question my instincts. I'll make sure I'm treating every passenger with fairness and respect, regardless of my assumptions. I'll be better." For a long moment, the room was silent. Sophia's expression remained calm, unreadable, but Miranda held her gaze, refusing to look away. Finally, Sophia nodded. "Apology accepted, Miss Blake," she said simply. Miranda exhaled, the weight of the moment settling in her chest. "Thank you," she said quietly. Sophia stood, gathering her bag. "The real apology comes from what you do moving forward," she said as she turned to leave. "Actions speak louder than words." Miranda watched her go, the truth of those words sinking deep into her bones. This meeting wouldn't erase what had happened, but it was a start, a chance to do better. That evening, as Sophia stepped out of the building and into the cool dusk air, she felt a quiet sense of closure settle over her. She had accepted Miranda's apology, but more importantly, she had reminded her of the responsibility we all carry to treat people with fairness, dignity, and respect. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from the airline's CEO. "We've finalized the training program you proposed. We'll send you updates as it's implemented. Thank you for holding us accountable." Sophia smiled faintly as she slipped her phone back into her bag. Small steps, she thought. Change did not happen all at once, but it had to start somewhere. And sometimes, all it took was for one person to refuse to let things slide. The days following Miranda Blake's meeting with Sophia Brooks felt like a blur. For Miranda, it was as if her entire world had been thrown under a spotlight. Though Sophia had accepted her apology, Miranda couldn't shake the weight of her actions. It wasn't just about what had happened to Sophia. It was about the uncomfortable truth she had been forced to confront about herself. Back in the airline's break room before her next flight, Miranda sat with her coffee growing cold in her hands. The other flight attendants were chatting around her, but she barely heard them. Her mind lingered on Sophia's words. Actions speak louder than words. She had apologized, but that wasn't enough. Now she needed to prove through her actions that she was capable of being better. "Miranda?" She looked up sharply to see Clara Summers standing beside her, clutching her own coffee cup. Clara's expression was tentative but kind, as though she could sense the storm brewing inside Miranda. "You okay?" Clara asked softly. Miranda hesitated before responding, her voice quieter than usual. "I'm trying to be." Clara sat down across from her. "I heard about your meeting with Miss Brooks," she said carefully. "How did it go?" Miranda frowned slightly, staring into her cup. "Better than I deserved. She accepted my apology, but she made it clear that what happens next matters more." Clara nodded, as though she understood perfectly. "She's right. You can't change what happened, but you can decide what you do, moving forward." Miranda met Clara's gaze, surprised by the wisdom in the younger woman's voice. Clara, with her innate kindness and moral clarity, had been part of what haunted Miranda. If someone like Clara could see the truth so easily, why had it been so hard for Miranda to see? "You stood up for her," Miranda said after a pause. "You did what I should have done." Clara flushed slightly, shaking her head. "I just did what I thought was right." Miranda studied her for a moment before offering a faint smile. "That's more than most people would have done." Clara shrugged. "Small things matter. They add up." Miranda leaned back in her chair, letting the words sink in. Clara was right. Small things did matter. If she wanted to prove that she had learned, then every choice she made from now on would need to reflect that. At the same time, Sophia Brooks sat at her office desk, scanning a new email from Richard Hale, the airline's CEO. Subject: Sensitivity Training Rollout. Status Update. Sophia read the message carefully. The program she had proposed was officially underway. Leadership teams across the company would begin their first sessions next week, and a full schedule for the flight crews was in place. Sophia appreciated the speed with which Richard had moved. It was rare to see a large organization commit to change this quickly. Still, Sophia knew better than to let herself get complacent. One program wouldn't undo years of ingrained habits, but it was a start. She was prepared to stay involved, to monitor the progress, and ensure that it wasn't just lip service. As she closed the email, her phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text from Clara Summers. Sophia had given the young flight attendant her contact information after the flight, sensing something special about her. Clara: "Hi, Miss Brooks. I hope you're doing well. I just wanted to thank you again for everything. The changes you're making are already starting to show. It's inspiring." Sophia's lips curved into a small smile as she typed a reply. Sophia: "Thank you, Clara. Never underestimate the impact of your kindness. Small gestures can change everything." Clara's words lingered with her. Sometimes, it took just one person, one small act, to set something bigger into motion. Miranda's next flight was scheduled for early the following morning. She arrived at the airport well before her shift, hoping to get a moment of peace before boarding began. The quiet hum of the terminal in the early hours was soothing, a rare moment of stillness before the day began. When she arrived at the crew briefing room, Dennis Myers was already there, reviewing the flight's details. He looked up as Miranda walked in, his sharp eyes scanning her face. "Morning, Miranda," he said calmly. "Morning," she replied softly, setting her bag down. Dennis leaned back slightly, studying her. "You look different today." Miranda frowned. "Different how?" Dennis gave a small shrug. "More focused. Like you've got something on your mind." Miranda sighed, sitting down across from him. "I do. I've been thinking about everything that happened with Miss Brooks, about how I let myself down. Let her down." Dennis's expression softened. "What are you going to do about it?" Miranda looked at him, her voice steady. "I'm going to be better. I can't undo what I did, but I can learn from it. I'm not letting this happen again." Dennis gave her a small nod of approval. "That's all you can do. Mistakes are only wasted if you don't learn from them." Miranda straightened, a faint sense of relief settling over her. Dennis's words were simple, but they were a lifeline. She had spent the last few days drowning in regret, but now she had something to hold on to. As passengers began boarding the plane, Miranda found herself hyper-aware of every interaction she had. She smiled warmly as she greeted each person, trying to be present to really see them. A young woman with a worn backpack struggled to find space in the overhead bin, and Miranda stepped forward without hesitation. "Let me help you with that," she said, her voice kind and genuine. The woman smiled, clearly grateful. "Thank you so much." "Of course," Miranda replied, carefully tucking the bag into place. Further down the aisle, she noticed an elderly man nervously clutching his boarding pass, unsure of where to sit. She approached him calmly. "Can I help you find your seat, sir?" The man looked up, relief washing over his face. "Yes, please. I'm in 16A. "Right this way," Miranda said, guiding him down the aisle. Each small interaction felt deliberate, as though Miranda was working to undo her mistakes, one moment at a time. She knew it would take time to rebuild herself, but she was determined to start now. Sophia Brooks was seated in her own office later that day when her assistant, Marcy, knocked softly on the door. "Miss Brooks, you have a package." Sophia looked up curiously. "A package?" Marcy nodded, handing her a small padded envelope. "It doesn't say who it's from, but it looks like it came through the airline." Sophia accepted the package, her brow furrowing slightly as she opened it. Inside, she found a handwritten letter on the airline's stationery. The handwriting was neat but careful, as though the writer had taken their time. "Dear Miss Brooks, I wanted to thank you not just for accepting my apology, but for holding me accountable. I needed to face what I did, and because of you, I've started to see how my assumptions hurt people. I can't change the past, but I promise you I'll do better from now on." Sincerely, Miranda Blake. Sophia read the letter twice, her expression thoughtful. There was no grand gesture, no excuses, just honesty and accountability. Sophia appreciated that. She folded the letter carefully and set it on her desk, a faint smile touching her lips. People could change, she thought, but they had to choose too. Miranda Blake had taken the first step, and sometimes that was enough. At the end of her flight, as the plane touched down and passengers began to disembark, Miranda stood at the front of the cabin. She smiled genuinely as each person passed her, her heart lighter than it had been in days. For the first time in a long time, Miranda felt like she was moving forward not perfectly, but intentionally. As Dennis walked past her, he gave her a small nod. "Good work today, Miranda," he said quietly. "Thanks, Dennis," she replied, her voice steady. As she watched the last passenger leave, Miranda exhaled softly. Actions spoke louder than words, and she was finally learning what that meant. Sophia Brooks sat quietly in the corner of her favorite cafe, the gentle hum of conversation around her creating a comforting backdrop. Sunlight poured through the large windows, casting soft golden streaks across the polished wooden floors. In front of her, a steaming cup of tea sat untouched. Sophia had come here to reflect, as she often did after something significant. A week had passed since her meeting with Miranda Blake and the subsequent rollout of the sensitivity training program. Progress, Sophia knew, was slow and unsteady, but she could feel its momentum beginning to take hold. The airline had moved quickly, as promised, sending her updates and reports on their first training sessions. Leadership had embraced the change, and, for the first time in a while, Sophia felt like she had nudged something forward that might outlast her. As she sipped her tea, Sophia's phone buzzed beside her on the table. She glanced down at the screen. It was a message from Clara Summers. "Clara. Miss Brooks, just wanted to share something with you. I was on a flight today, and our senior attendant, Miranda, handled the situation beautifully. A passenger was upset over seating, and she was patient, calm, and fair. I could see how much thought she put into her actions. I thought you should know." Sophia stared at the message for a long moment, a quiet warmth spreading through her chest. She typed back a quick reply. Sophia, thank you for sharing that, Clara. It means more than you know. She set her phone down and looked out the window, the corners of her lips curving into a faint smile. Small steps. That's how real change always started. On the other side of the city, Miranda Blake was preparing for her next flight. She stood in the crew briefing room, listening as Dennis Myers walked the team through the day's flight details. Miranda's mind was sharp, her focus clear, but her approach to the day was different now, more intentional. She had spent the last week applying what she had learned. Every decision she made, no matter how small, was guided by fairness and thoughtfulness. She checked her instincts constantly, asking herself whether they were rooted in assumptions. It was exhausting, in some ways, to unlearn habits she hadn't realized she'd had, but it was necessary. When the briefing ended, Dennis approached her with a subtle nod. "How are you holding up?" he asked quietly, his voice low enough that the others couldn't hear. Miranda offered a small smile. "Better. I'm trying, Dennis." He nodded approvingly. "I can see that. It doesn't happen overnight, but you're on the right path." Miranda exhaled, grateful for his support. Dennis had been a steady presence through everything, guiding her without judgment. He hadn't sugar-coated her mistakes, but he hadn't abandoned her either. "You know," Dennis added, his tone softening, "it's not about being perfect. It's about showing people you're willing to learn. That's how you earn trust back." Miranda thought of Sophia, then the calm way she had listened to Miranda's apology, the way her words had pushed Miranda to do better without shaming her. "I know," Miranda replied. "I just hope it's enough." The flight that day was a short one, just a 2-hour connection between New York and Chicago, but Miranda treated it with the same care as any long-haul journey. She moved through the cabin with steady composure, checking on passengers and ensuring that everyone felt seen and valued. Halfway through the flight, a young mother with a fussy baby struggled to calm her child in the middle of the economy cabin. The murmurs of frustration from nearby passengers began to grow, and the mother's face flushed red with embarrassment as she tried to soothe her baby. Miranda noticed immediately and stepped forward. "Ma'am," she said softly, kneeling down beside the woman's seat. "Let me see how I can help." The mother looked up at her, her eyes wide with surprise. I'm sorry. I know he's bothering everyone." "It's okay," Miranda said reassuringly. "Babies cry. It's what they do." She smiled warmly, her tone steady. "Would it help if I brought you a warm towel or a bottle of water? Something to help calm both of you?" The woman's shoulders sagged with relief. "That would be wonderful." "Thank you." Miranda quickly returned with the towel and water, her demeanor calm and unhurried. She even took a moment to coo gently at the baby, making him giggle just slightly. "There you go, little one," Miranda said softly. The mother smiled, tears shimmering faintly in her eyes. "Thank you for being so kind. I was afraid I'd get scolded or something." "Not on my watch," Miranda replied gently. "You're doing great." As Miranda turned to walk away, she noticed a few passengers watching her with surprise, some even offering small, understanding smiles toward the young mother. Miranda felt a faint sense of pride ripple through her. A week ago, she might not have handled the situation this way, but now she knew better. After the flight, as passengers filed off the plane, the young mother paused at the exit to speak to Miranda. "I just wanted to say thank you again," she said softly. "I really appreciated how you treated us." Miranda smiled, her voice sincere. "It was my pleasure. Safe travels." Dennis, who was standing nearby, gave Miranda a small nod of approval once the passengers were gone. "See?" he said quietly. "That's how it's done." Miranda smiled faintly, feeling a lightness she hadn't felt in weeks. Later that evening, as Sophia Brooks settled back into her apartment after a long day of meetings, she received an unexpected email from the airline's executive office. It was a report on the progress of the training program she had proposed. Sophia read through it carefully, noting the steps they were taking to integrate bias awareness and fairness into every layer of the organization. She smiled faintly as she reached a section that highlighted crew feedback. One comment in particular caught her eye. "It's uncomfortable to realize where you've gone wrong, but it's also an opportunity to be better. I'm grateful for that chance." Crew member Sophia didn't need to guess who had written it. She leaned back in her chair, letting out a long breath. Change was not perfect, and it was never easy. But it was happening one person at a time, one choice at a time. The next morning, as Clara Summers prepared for her own flight, she received a text message from Sophia. "Sophia, thank you for standing up when it mattered, Clara. Never lose that courage. The world needs more people like you." Clara grinned, tucking her phone back into her bag before heading to the airport. Sophia's words stayed with her as she went about her day, reminding her of the power small moments could carry. By the end of the week, Miranda found herself standing at the front of a briefing room, speaking to a group of new flight attendants. She hadn't expected to be asked to address them, but Dennis had convinced her that her story could make a difference. "I made a mistake," Miranda admitted, her voice steady but humble. "I judged someone unfairly, and I learned a hard lesson because of it. But that experience taught me something important. People deserve to be seen for who they are, not who we assume them to be. Every passenger, every person matters. And if you lead with kindness and fairness, you'll never regret it." The room was silent for a moment before a few of the trainees nodded, absorbing her words. Dennis, who stood at the back of the room, offered Miranda a small, approving smile. As Miranda stepped down, she felt something shift inside her. She would never be perfect, but she could keep trying. And in the end, that was what mattered. Sophia Brooks sat in her office later that afternoon, gazing out the window at the city below. The sun was shining, and the streets were alive with movement. People going about their day, small moments of connection happening everywhere. She thought back to the journey that had brought her here, to the people who had shown her kindness, and the ones who had needed to learn. Change, she realized, didn't happen all at once. But if you kept showing up, if you pushed for progress and encouraged accountability, it would ripple outward, reaching further than you ever imagined. As she closed her notebook for the day, Sophia smiled softly to herself. Small steps, always small steps, and sometimes that was enough. As Sophia Brooks gazed out over the city, a sense of quiet satisfaction settled over her. Small steps, small gestures, and the courage to speak up had led to something greater, a ripple of change that would outlast her and touch others she might never meet. And that's the power of kindness, accountability, and growth. Change doesn't always begin with grand gestures. It starts with the smallest actions and the people brave enough to take them. Thank you for joining us for this story of resilience, hope, and the strength to be better. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories just like this one. Together, we can build a world where small steps lead to big change. See you in the next one.